Barron Trump's unexpected act of kindness on a train journey, a simple gesture that led to a stunning revelation from a veteran and a connection no one saw coming. This story isn't just about generosity, it's about how kindness can echo across generations in ways we never imagine. The Silver Crest Express hummed softly as it prepared to depart New York City, its polished exterior reflecting the morning sunlight. Inside, the train's first-class cabins were a world of quiet luxury, plush leather seats, mahogany paneling, and a serene atmosphere where travelers sipped coffee and read newspapers. Among them sat Barron Trump, a tall, reserved teenager tucked into a private window seat, thumbing through a hardcover book. Unlike his famous family, Barron preferred to remain out of the public eye, traveling alone and keeping to himself. His name still turned heads, but today, he hoped to blend into the background. Further back in the economy section, an elderly man in a worn military coat adjusted his seat with visible difficulty. Henry Lawson, a veteran, carried himself with quiet dignity, his silver hair neatly combed, his coat adorned with faded medals, a silent testimony of his service. As he shuffled to his seat, some passengers offered respectful nods, while others merely glanced, their focus returning to their screens and conversation. As the final boarding call echoed through the station, Henry's seatmate, a restless businessman, sighed, visibly annoyed by the limited space. A subtle tension settled over the car, though no one said a word. Barron, in first class, happened to glance up, catching sight of the man's military jacket, just as the train doors closed. What he didn't know was that this moment would set off a chain of events that no one on board could have predicted. As the Silver Crest Express pulled away from the station, the soft murmur of conversation filled the train. The first-class passengers settled into their luxury seating, sipping espresso and browsing their tablets, while the economy section buzzed with quiet movement. Passengers adjusting their bags, flipping through magazines, and shifting in their compact seats. Among them, Henry Lawson, the elderly veteran, tried to get comfortable, but it was clear he was struggling. His rigid posture and careful movements betrayed a discomfort he tried to hide. Wedged between a chatty businessman scrolling through stock reports and a college student bobbing her head to music, Henry tried to adjust his seat, wincing slightly as he leaned back. The cramped space made it difficult for him to stretch his aching legs, the lingering effects of old injuries from his time in war. He sighed, gripping the frayed strap of his leather duffel bag, his fingers brushing over the medals sewn onto his coat, a silent reminder of sacrifices long past. The businessman next to him barely glanced his way, but the passenger across the aisle, a young mother cradling a sleeping toddler, offered him a small smile. Others, however, exchanged looks of mild discomfort, unsure whether to acknowledge the veteran or look away. Some whispered softly, their curiosity evident. Then, a quiet exchange with the train attendant changed everything. Henry cleared his throat and politely asked if any seats with extra legroom were available, explaining his difficulty sitting for long periods due to his old war injuries. The attendant, Samantha, a kind-faced woman in her mid-30s, frowned sympathetically but shook her head. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said gently. "The train is fully booked today." Henry nodded in understanding, his expression unreadable. A few rows ahead, Barron Trump overheard the conversation. He glanced up from his book, his eyes briefly landing on the elderly man shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He didn't say anything. Not yet. But something about the moment made him pause. A quiet decision was forming in his mind, though he didn't know it yet. Barron Trump sat still in his first-class seat, his book open but forgotten. His gaze lingered on the elderly veteran in economy, watching as he shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his coat and massaging his knee with a wince. Barron wasn't one for public gestures, and he had been raised in a world where luxury and privilege were the norm. But something about the man's quiet dignity, the way he never complained despite his visible discomfort, stirred something in him. The train attendant Samantha had already moved on, apologizing once more as she made her way back toward the front of the train. Barron's fingers hovered over the call button for a moment, then pressed it. Within seconds, Samantha reappeared, offering a professional smile. "Is there something I can get you, sir?" she asked. Barron gestured toward the economy section, toward Henry. "Can I switch seats with the man in the military coat?" His voice was calm but firm. Samantha blinked, momentarily caught off guard. First-class passengers rarely gave up their seats, let alone teenagers with a last name that carried weight. She hesitated, glancing toward Henry before leaning in slightly. "Are you sure? You paid for it." "I'm sure," Barron interrupted gently. A few first-class passengers lowered their newspapers, their attention peaked. The businessman across the aisle, James, a sharp-dressed executive with an air of self-importance, raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to do that, kid," he remarked, his tone half curious, half dismissive. "It's first class for a reason." Barron simply shrugged. "Some people deserve it more." The response silenced James. Even Samantha, usually composed, couldn't hide her admiration. She nodded quickly and moved toward the back to inform Henry. As Barron stood, grabbing his bag without hesitation, the murmurs in first class grew louder. A few passengers exchanged glances, some surprised, others secretly impressed. By the time Henry looked up in disbelief, the entire section was witnessing something they hadn't expected from a teenager whose life had been defined by privilege. What happened next would leave the entire train speechless. The entire first-class cabin fell silent as Samantha approached Henry's seat in economy. The veteran looked up, surprised by the attendant's return. "Sir," she began, her voice softer than before, "there's a passenger in first class who would like to switch seats with you." Henry frowned, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as if bracing himself. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't want to take someone else's seat," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of discipline. Samantha glanced back toward first class, where Barron now stood, his carry-on slung over his shoulder, waiting patiently. She gave Henry a knowing look. "He insists, sir, and I think you should meet him." Slowly, Henry followed her gaze, his eyes landing on Barron Trump. The young man gave a small nod, his expression unreadable yet sincere. For a moment, Henry hesitated. He had been offered things before, discounted meals, free drinks, but this felt different. This wasn't pity, it was respect. As Henry pushed himself up from his seat, the murmurs began again. "Is he really giving up first class? That's the Trump kid, right? I wouldn't have expected this. Unbelievable, a teenager willing to do this?" Passengers in both sections of the train craned their necks to watch. Barron extended a hand as Henry approached. "Are you sure about this, young man?" Henry asked, his voice low but steady. "I am," Barron replied simply. "Thank you for your service." A hush fell over the crowd. Henry studied Barron's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he grasped the young man's hand firmly, shaking it with a grateful nod. "Well, thank you, son," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion. As Henry made his way toward first class, the murmurs shifted from confusion to admiration. A woman near the window discreetly wiped her eyes. The businessman from earlier, James, cleared his throat uncomfortably, looking away as if reconsidering his own judgment. Meanwhile, Barron slipped into Henry's now empty economy seat, casually adjusting to the tight space as if nothing had happened. He opened his book again, flipping to his place as if the exchange had been no more significant than offering someone a cup of coffee. But for the passengers around him, and especially for Henry, this was far from ordinary. It was a moment they would never forget. As Henry settled into his new first-class seat, he slowly ran his fingers over the plush armrests, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of the moment. A flight attendant approached with a warm towel and a drink, offering him a small, knowing smile. "The young man said you should have this seat," she explained softly. Henry gave a quiet chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's been a long time since I've been treated like this," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Seated beside him was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, who had watched the entire exchange unfold. She studied the veteran for a moment before speaking. "That was a special thing he did for you," she said gently. Henry nodded, exhaling deeply as he adjusted the small purple heart pin on his lapel. He hesitated, then said, I have to say something." The woman tilted her head in curiosity. Henry sighed, staring out the window as the landscape blurred past, then turned to her. "That young man's family once saved my life." The woman blinked. "You mean the Trumps?" Henry nodded slowly. "It was decades ago, right after war. I came home to a country that didn't welcome us back. I was lost. No family support, no real direction. I was injured, barely scraping by in New York." He paused, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "One night, I met a man outside a diner. He saw me struggling and didn't just throw me a few bucks. He sat with me, listened. That man was Fred Trump." The woman's eyes widened. "Donald Trump's father?" "That's right." Henry's expression softened as memories long buried surfaced once more. "Fred Trump found me work, got me a place to stay. Expected nothing in return. Just said, 'You served this country, it's the least we can do.'" The woman sat in stunned silence, letting his words sink in. Henry let out a small, wistful chuckle. "And now, all these years later, his grandson just gave me his first-class seat, without a second thought." The passengers nearby who had been listening in silence exchanged stunned glances. What had seemed like a simple act of kindness had now taken on a deeper, almost fateful meaning. Henry leaned back, his gaze once again drifting toward the economy section, where Barron sat quietly, still lost in his book, unaware of the full-circle moment that had just unfolded. As the Silver Crest Express continued its journey, the weight of Henry's revelation spread quietly through the train. Passengers who had once merely observed the seat exchange now whispered amongst themselves, passing along the veteran's story like a ripple in still water. What had begun as a simple act of generosity had transformed into something much deeper, something almost destined. A businessman seated nearby, who had earlier questioned Barron's decision, now looked visibly moved. He sighed, rubbing his chin before murmuring to himself, "Maybe I judged him too quickly." Across the aisle, a young mother, cradling her toddler, exchanged glances with the woman next to her. "You don't see this kind of thing often," she whispered. "It reminds you that kindness still matters." Meanwhile, the train attendant, Samantha, who had first facilitated the switch, felt a lump in her throat as she processed the moment. It was one thing to see a wealthy teenager give up his luxury seat, but to find out that this gesture carried a deeper connection to the past? It was something she'd never forget. Passengers in both first-class and economy sections began to shift in their seats, their initial amusement giving way to introspection. How often had they ignored someone's struggles? How many times had they assumed that wealth and privilege meant entitlement, rather than humility? Back in economy class, Barron remained unaware of the growing murmurs, still flipping through the pages of his book as if nothing unusual had happened. He had acted on instinct, without expectation of recognition or praise, and yet, the impact of his choice was now undeniable. Henry, still seated in first class, glanced back toward Barron, his expression unreadable. He had carried his gratitude for Fred Trump's kindness for decades, never expecting to repay it. But now he saw something familiar in the young man, a quiet decency, an echo of the past. Passengers continued whispering, and the atmosphere in the train felt different, lighter, more thoughtful. Something rare had just unfolded before them, and whether they knew it or not, they had all become part of a story that would be remembered far beyond this journey. As the train neared Chicago, the hushed murmurs in first class had not faded. The weight of Henry's revelation still lingered in the air, leaving passengers deep in thought. Meanwhile, in economy class, Barron remained unaware of the full impact of his decision. He had returned to his book, his long frame adjusting easily to the tighter seat, seemingly unfazed by the stares still directed his way. Then Samantha, the train attendant, made her way toward him. She paused beside his seat, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I thought you should know," she said gently. "The man you gave your seat to, Henry, he told us something incredible." Barron looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Years ago, your grandfather, Fred Trump, helped him when he was at his lowest point. He gave him a place to stay, a job, and expected nothing in return. Henry never forgot that kindness, and today, you did something for him that reminded him of it. Barron didn't speak right away. His fingers idly traced the edges of his book as he processed her words. His face remained composed, but something in his eyes shifted, deepened, as if the meaning of the moment had finally settled over him. After a long pause, he nodded once, slowly, then said simply, "That's something." Samantha smiled, knowing he understood. The moment, though brief, had come full circle, a quiet, unspoken legacy of kindness, passed down through generations. As the train pulled into Chicago, passengers gathered their belongings, but the weight of what had transpired remained in the air. Just before disembarking, Henry Lawson stood from his first-class seat, his hands steady as he adjusted his military coat. Instead of heading toward the exit, he turned back toward economy, his sharp eyes scanning the rows until they landed on Barron Trump. Barron, now standing to retrieve his bag, looked up in quiet surprise as Henry approached. The veteran extended his hand, his voice steady, but filled with meaning. "Young man, I wanted to thank you face to face. Your family has a history of kindness, and today you continued it. Never forget how much these moments matter." Barron grasped his hand firmly, his tone simple but sincere. "You deserved it, sir." Around them, passengers watched in respectful silence. Some had tears in their eyes, others simply nodded, understanding they had witnessed something rare and meaningful. As Henry walked away, Barron reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He hesitated, then typed a brief message. "Grandpa would have been proud today." With that, he slipped his phone back into his pocket and stepped off the train, carrying with him not just a story, but a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The story of Barron Trump's selfless act on the train teaches a powerful lesson about kindness, gratitude, and the unseen connections that shape our lives. In a world where wealth often creates barriers between people, Barron's decision to give up his first-class seat for a veteran proved that true generosity comes from the heart, not status. His simple, instinctive act of respect mirrored an act of kindness from his grandfather, Fred Trump, decades earlier, showing that the impact of compassion can echo across generations. Henry's revelation serves as a reminder that even small gestures can carry immense meaning. The kindness Fred Trump showed him all those years ago gave him hope when he needed it most, and in an unexpected turn of fate, his grandson unknowingly repaid that kindness. This moment highlights that acts of goodwill don't just disappear, they continue to inspire and shape the lives of others. More importantly, the story challenges us to ask ourselves, how do we treat people, especially those who have given so much for others? Kindness doesn't have to be grand, it just has to be genuine, and sometimes, the smallest actions leave the deepest impact.